Ever get that feeling? Like, when someone says something totally sexist and you're like, do I say something? Should I just let it go? It's like a minefield, right?
It really is. And you know, what's even trickier is figuring out how to respond when the sexism isn't the blatant in-your-face kind, but more of the seemingly well-intentioned variety.
Ugh. Yeah, the bless your heart kind of sexism.
Exactly. And that's actually what we're diving into today. How do people perceive women who confront sexism, especially when it comes in that more subtle and seemingly positive packaging?
So we're basically tackling the age-old question. Is it worth it to call out sexism, even when it comes disguised as a compliment?
Precisely. And to really get to the bottom of this, we're going to be looking at a fascinating study. It's called Perceptions of Women Who Confront Hostile and Benevolent Sexism.
Okay, so 3 separate studies all looking at this dynamic.
Exactly. They really wanted to dig deep and see what's really going on when women confront these different flavors of sexism.
Cool. So for everyone listening, our mission today is to break down these studies and uncover what they reveal about how people view women who speak up against sexism, whether it's the kind that makes your skin crawl or the kind that leaves you feeling, well, it's just a little bit icky.
Yeah. We want to give you a clearer picture of the social consequences and the potential backlash women might face when they choose to confront sexism.
Awesome. Let's get started. So this study talks about the ambivalent nature of sexism, which sounds kind of complicated. What exactly does that mean?
It means that sexism isn't just straightforward negativity. It can actually be kind of tricky. Like, it can be hostile and aggressive, but also...
Seemingly nice.
Exactly. And the researchers call this benevolent sexism. And get this, they actually argue that both of these forms of sexism work together, you know? Like, they're two sides of the same coin.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's not just that there's bad sexism and good sexism. It's more like they both contribute to keeping women in a certain place.
Right. They both, in their own way, reinforce traditional gender roles and inequalities,
Mhm.
even if one seems more, well, palatable on the surface.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's talk about hostile sexism first. I think most people have a pretty clear idea of what that is. Like, it's the obvious stuff, right?
Yeah. It's the outright negative attitudes and beliefs about women, the kind of stuff that just makes you cringe, like believing women are inherently less competent than men, or that they're always trying to manipulate their way to the top.
Right. Or saying things like women are just too emotional or they're always playing the victim card.
Exactly. That's classic hostile sexism. And to give you a concrete example from the study, one of the scenarios they used involved a comment on an International Women's Day post that basically said, you know, women already have equal rights and they're just too easily offended.
Ugh. Yeah, I've definitely seen those kinds of comments online. They're like everywhere.
Unfortunately, yes, and that's a perfect example of hostile sexism in action.
Okay, so let's move on to benevolent sexism, which, like we said, is a little trickier to spot. Can you give us a clear definition? Like, what does it actually look like?
So, benevolent sexism, as the name suggests, often presents itself as positive or even chivalrous. It might involve praising women for their warmth, the nurturing qualities, or, you know, their
Yeah.
beauty.
Like those stereotypical feminine traits.
Exactly. But the catch is that these seemingly positive attributes are often used to justify treating women as fragile, dependent, or in need of protection. It's like saying, women are wonderful, but they can't handle the tough stuff.
Oh, okay. I'm starting to see how that can be problematic. It's like it sets women up to be less powerful.
Exactly. It reinforces this idea that women need men to take care of them and make decisions for them.
And the study breaks down benevolent sexism into 3 specific categories, right? Can we talk about those?
Absolutely. So the first one is protective paternalism. This is the belief that men have a duty to protect and provide for women. You know, the classic knight in shining armor trope.
Oh, I see. So it's like that old-fashioned idea that women are delicate flowers who need to be sheltered from the harsh realities of the world.
Exactly. It might sound romantic, but ultimately it limits women's agency and independence.
Okay, what's the second category?
The second one is complementary gender differentiation. This is the belief that men and women have inherently different strengths and weaknesses that complement each other. You know, the whole men are from Mars, women are from Venus thing.
Right, like the idea that men are logical and decisive while women are emotional and nurturing.
Yeah, that's the classic example. And while this might seem harmless on the surface, it often leads to rigid gender roles and limits opportunities for both men and women.
I can see that. It's like it pigeonholes people into these predetermined boxes based on their gender.
Exactly. And the third category, though it wasn't directly explored in the context of confrontations in this particular study, is heterosexual intimacy.
What does that one involve?
Well, this one centers around the idea that men and women are inherently incomplete without each other romantically and sexually.
Okay, so it's like that whole opposites attract and men need women to complete them kind of thinking.
Exactly. And while romantic relationships are obviously an important part of life, this particular aspect of benevolent sexism can sometimes be used to justify controlling behavior or to pressure women into conforming to traditional relationship roles.
So we've got hostile sexism, which is the outright negative stuff, and then these three flavors of benevolent sexism, which are all kind of sneaky in their own way.
Right. And what the researchers wanted to figure out was how people react when women confront these different types of sexism.
Yeah, because we all know it's not always easy to speak up. Like, you might worry about being seen as aggressive or oversensitive, right?
Exactly. And the research actually confirms that confronting sexism, regardless of the type, can be risky. It can lead to all sorts of negative social consequences.
Really. Even when you're calling out blatant hostility.
Yes. Unfortunately, even then you might be labeled as difficult, a troublemaker, or, someone who's just too quick to take offense.
Wow, so there's really no winning, is there?
Well, it's not quite that bleak. There is some evidence that confronting sexism, even when it's risky, can have positive outcomes. Like it can lead to a decrease in sexist language or behavior in the immediate environment, and it can boost the confronter's self-esteem.
Oh, that's encouraging. So even though there are risks, speaking up can actually make a difference.
Potentially.
Mm.
But the research also highlights that women often hesitate to confront sexism, and there are a couple of key reasons why this might be.
Like what?
Well, as we already mentioned, there's the fear of negative social repercussions.
Yeah.
Like you might worry about being seen as a complainer or someone who overreacts. And on top of that, there's this perception that sexism, especially the benevolent kind, isn't as serious or harmful as other forms of prejudice.
Oh, that's interesting. So you might be less likely to confront sexism if you think other people don't even see it as a big deal.
Exactly. It's like, why bother rocking the boat if no one else even thinks there's a problem?
That makes sense. And the researchers actually connect this to existing research on confronting positive racial stereotypes. Why is that relevant?
Because, as it turns out, there's evidence that people who confront positive racial stereotypes actually face more social backlash than those who confront negative racial stereotypes.
Oh, wow. Why is that?
Well, the thinking is that because positive stereotypes are framed as compliments, calling them out can be seen as ungrateful, nitpicky, or overly sensitive. It's like saying, hey, stop trying to be nice to me, which can rub people the wrong way.
Okay, so the researchers were wondering if the same dynamic might apply to benevolent sexism. Like, if calling out seemingly positive sexist remarks would lead to more negative reactions than calling out hostile sexism.
Exactly. And that's one of the key questions they set out to explore in these studies.
Okay, cool. So let's dive into the first study. What did they actually do?
So, in the first study, they used a social media paradigm. Basically, they had participants read a hypothetical Facebook post about International Women's Day and then look at a series of comments that were supposedly made in response to that post.
Oh, that's clever. I can totally see how that would be a relevant scenario for a lot of people. What kind of comments were they shown?
Well, the researchers manipulated two key things. First, they varied whether a male commenter made a hostile sexist comment or a benevolent sexist comment, specifically of the protective paternalism variety.
Okay, so they were comparing reactions to like women are too easily offended versus women need to be protected.
Exactly. And the second thing they manipulated was whether the original poster, who was either male or female, confronted the sexist comment or not.
Okay, so they were looking at whether people reacted differently depending on the type of sexism being confronted and the gender of the person doing the confronting.
Exactly. And then after reading the scenario, participants rated the original poster on a bunch of different dimensions, like how likable they were, how competent they seemed, and whether they came across as a complainer.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat here. What were the main takeaways?
Okay, drum roll, please. The most surprising finding was that confronting benevolent sexism, in this case, protective paternalism, was not more costly than confronting hostile sexism.
Wait, really? That's not what I expected at all.
I know, right? It actually goes against that initial hypothesis we were talking about.
So it's not necessarily worse to call out the seemingly nice sexism.
Not according to this study. And what's even more interesting is that this finding was consistent across all three studies, so it seems to be a pretty robust pattern.
That is really fascinating and honestly pretty encouraging. It's like a little bit of hope in this whole minefield of confronting sexism.
I know. It suggests that maybe we don't have to be quite as afraid to challenge those subtle forms of sexism that often fly under the radar.
But I'm guessing it wasn't all sunshine and roses. Like, there were some nuances in the findings.
Oh, definitely. For example, when looking at the data overall, regardless of whether the target confronted the sexism or not, those who were targeted with benevolent sexism were perceived as greater complainers compared to those who were targeted with hostile sexism. So there's clearly still some underlying bias going on.
Oh, so even if you don't say anything, just being on the receiving end of benevolent sexism might lead others to view you more negatively.
It seems that way. And another nuance they found was that female targets who responded to benevolent sexism, regardless of whether they directly confronted it or not, were seen as greater complainers than female targets who responded to hostile sexism.
Oh, interesting. So for women specifically, just reacting to benevolent sexism, even without a direct confrontation, could lead to this complainer label.
It seems so. And what's also interesting is that male targets' complainer perceptions didn't really differ between the two types of sexism. So there seems to be something specific about how women are perceived when they react to benevolent sexism.
Okay, so for women, it's almost like they're damned if they do, damned if they don't.
Yeah, it's a tough spot to be in. And another layer to consider is the gender of the people who were evaluating the targets. So remember how participants rated the original poster on things like likability and competence?
Yeah.
Well, they found a pretty consistent gender difference in how participants viewed the confronters. Women consistently rated confronters more positively than men did, regardless of the type of sexism being confronted.
Oh, really? That makes a lot of sense, actually. Women are probably more likely to recognize the harm of both hostile and benevolent sexism, so they might be more supportive of someone speaking up.
Right. And what's even more interesting is that men actually liked the targets more when they didn't confront the sexism, whereas women liked the targets more when they did confront the sexism.
Wow, that's a pretty stark difference. So it really highlights the importance of considering who's doing the perceiving in these situations.
Absolutely. Your audience matters.
Oh, wow.
So that was study one, which, as you can see, gave us some really interesting and unexpected results.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing to think that confronting those nice sexist comments might not be as risky as we initially thought.
I know. It's definitely food for thought. But of course, this was just one study, and they wanted to explore this dynamic further.
Right, so tell us about study 2. What did they change or add to the mix?
So study two built upon study one by adding a third condition. So instead of just comparing hostile sexism and protective paternalism, they also included a condition where the male commenter made a sexist remark based on complementary gender differentiation. Remember, that's the whole men and women have different strengths and weaknesses thing.
Right, so now they're comparing reactions to 3 different types of sexism. Did they change anything else about the scenario?
Nope, the basic setup remained the same. Participants still read a Facebook post about International Women's Day and a series of comments, but this time they were exposed to one of 3 types of sexist comments.
Cool. And what did they find? Did the results from study 1 hold up?
Well, in terms of benevolent sexism not being more costly to confront than hostile sexism, yes, that pattern was replicated.
Oh, phew. I was kind of worried that finding was a fluke.
Nope, it seems to be a real thing. But they did find a really interesting difference within the 2 types of benevolent sexism. Specifically, they found that confronting complementary gender differentiation, the men and women are just different kind of sexism, actually led to greater negative perceptions of the confronter than confronting protective paternalism.
Oh, wow. So even though confronting benevolent sexism in general wasn't worse than confronting hostile sexism, there seems to be a hierarchy within benevolent sexism.
Exactly. It's like there are different levels of risk depending on which type of benevolent sexism you're calling out.
That is so interesting. So maybe challenging the idea that men and women are just fundamentally different is seen as more threatening or taboo than challenging the idea that men need to protect women.
That's a really interesting possibility. And the researchers actually found further support for this idea when they looked at how participants perceive the appropriateness of confronting the different types of sexism. They found that participants viewed the target as significantly more appropriate for confronting protective paternalism than for confronting complementary gender differentiation.
Okay, so it's not just that people saw the confronters more negatively when they challenged complementary gender differentiation. They actually thought it was less appropriate to confront this type of sexism in the first place.
Exactly. It's like there's this unwritten rule that you're not supposed to challenge the idea that men and women are inherently different.
And what about that gender difference we saw in study 1? Did it show up again in study 2?
You bet it did. Once again, women liked the confronter more and perceived her as less of a complainer than men did, regardless of which type of sexism she confronted.
Okay, so it seems like that gender difference in perceptions is pretty consistent across different scenarios.
Yeah, it seems to be a pretty robust finding. So we've got two studies down, both suggesting that confronting benevolent sexism, while potentially risky, isn't necessarily worse than confronting hostile sexism. And we've also got this intriguing finding that there might be a hierarchy within benevolent sexism, with some types being more risky to confront than others.
Yeah, this is all so fascinating. So what about study 3? What new insights did they uncover?
So in study 3, the researchers wanted to replicate and refine the findings from the first two studies. And to do this, they made a couple of key changes to the experimental paradigm.
Like what?
Well, first of all, they switched up the topic of the Facebook post. So instead of being about International Women's Day, the post was about a new policy requiring companies to include more women on their executive boards.
Oh, interesting. So they wanted to see if the same patterns would hold up in a different context.
Exactly. And the second change they made was to the content of the complementary gender differentiation comment. In the first two studies, the comment was a bit more subtle and indirect. But in study 3, they decided to use a more explicit and negative stereotype about women's leadership abilities.
Oh, okay. So they wanted to make the potential harm of complementary gender differentiation more obvious.
Precisely. They were curious to see if that would change how people reacted to the confrontation.
That's a really smart tweak. So what did they find with these changes?
Well, once again, they found that confronting benevolent sexism, whether it was protective paternalism or this more explicit version of complementary gender differentiation, was not evaluated more negatively than confronting hostile sexism.
Okay, so that main finding is holding strong.
Yep, it seems pretty solid. And in this study, there was actually no significant difference in how appropriate it was seen to confront protective paternalism versus complementary gender differentiation.
Oh, interesting. So maybe when the harmful implications of complementary gender differentiation are made more explicit, as they were in this study, people are more likely to see the confrontation as justified.
That's a plausible interpretation. It suggests that the clarity of the message and the severity of the stereotype being challenged might play a role in how people perceive the confronter. And you'll probably be happy to know that the gender difference we saw in the first two studies also replicated in study 3.
Of course. I was wondering about that. So once again, women were more supportive of the confronter than men.
Yep, that's exactly what they found. And men did perceive the confronter as slightly more of a complainer, but this effect wasn't as statistically strong as in the earlier studies.
Okay, so the gender difference is still there, but maybe it's a little bit less pronounced when the benevolent sexism is more explicitly harmful.
That's a possibility. So there you have it. 3 studies, all pointing to the same general conclusion. Confronting benevolent sexism, while not without its risks, might not be as socially costly as we often fear.
It's amazing how consistent the findings were across all 3 studies. But before we wrap up, can we talk about the limitations of the research?
Absolutely. The researchers themselves acknowledge that their findings should be interpreted with caution.
What were some of the key limitations they highlighted?
Well, one limitation is that they only focused on 2 of the 3 subcomponents of benevolent sexism: protective paternalism and complementary gender differentiation. Remember how we talked about heterosexual intimacy as the third component?
Yeah, the whole men and women need each other to be complete thing.
Right. Well, that aspect of benevolent sexism wasn't explored in the context of confrontation in these studies. So we don't know how people might react if someone were to challenge, say, a comment about women needing men to be truly fulfilled.
That's a really interesting avenue for future research. It would be fascinating to see if the same patterns hold up in that context.
Totally agree. And another limitation the researchers point out is that their studies used very specific hypothetical scenarios. They acknowledge that the real world is messy and complex, and the context in which sexism occurs can dramatically influence how people react to confrontations.
Right. So we shouldn't assume that these findings will apply perfectly to every situation.
Exactly. Like the relationship between the people involved, the power dynamics at play, and even the specific words being used can all affect how a confrontation is perceived.
Okay, so we need to take these findings with a grain of salt. But even so, it's still pretty remarkable, right? Like, Who would have thought that confronting benevolent sexism might not be as risky as we tend to assume?
I know, it's definitely a game changer. It challenges a lot of our preconceived notions about how to navigate sexism.
So what's the main takeaway for our listeners? What should they keep in mind as they go about their daily lives?
Well, for me, the key message is that confronting benevolent sexism, while potentially uncomfortable or awkward, might not lead to the level of social backlash that many women fear. And this is especially true if you are a woman, and if the benevolent sexism you're confronting is expressed in a way that makes its harmful implications clear.
Okay, so don't be afraid to call out those subtle digs, even if they come disguised as compliments. But what about those situations where the sexism is more subtle or indirect, like with those beliefs about men and women having fundamentally different natures?
Right, those situations can be trickier. And the research suggests that you might face more resistance or negative reactions when challenging those kinds of deeply ingrained beliefs.
So maybe it's a matter of picking your battles, like choosing to speak up when the sexism is particularly harmful or when you feel like you have the social support to back you up.
That's probably a wise approach. And remember, the research consistently showed that women tend to be more supportive of confronters than men. So if you're a woman confronting sexism, you might find more allies among other women.
Yeah, that makes sense. So knowing all of this, how do you think it changes the way we should approach confronting sexism in our own lives?
That's a great question, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot since reading this research. I think it challenges us to be more aware of the different ways sexism manifests, even in its more subtle forms. And it also encourages us to be more deliberate and strategic in how we choose to confront it.
Right. It's like now that we know that confronting benevolent sexism might not be as risky as we thought, it opens up new possibilities for how we can challenge sexism and create more equitable social environments.
Exactly. It's about being empowered to speak up in a way that feels authentic and effective for you, while also considering the context and the potential consequences.
And I think that's a great place to leave it for today. Thank you so much for this incredible deep dive into this important research. It's definitely given me a lot to think about.
My pleasure. It's always so rewarding to discuss these complex topics and hopefully spark some meaningful conversations.
And for all of you listening, we hope this episode has given you some new insights into the dynamics of confronting sexism. And as always, we encourage you to continue exploring these issues in your own lives and to engage in thoughtful conversations with those around you.